I have had so much fun taking in the many comments that you guys have left on my first of two videos about the recently released Bob Dylan biopic, A Complete Unknown. 48 and counting at last check. I just posted the video a couple days ago. You guys are amazing. You bring so much energy and fun energy and vigor and great ideas to that discussion. And I am so grateful. And that includes, by the way, my apparent haters whose comments have been the most fun and probably gotten the biggest laughs out of me. You're all awesome. It's just been so much fun to engage with you guys on this topic that is dear to my heart. I've told you guys I'm a passionate Dylan fan, and I really am enjoying the discussion that you guys have made possible just by coming by and having your crack at the conversation that this video has generated. I'm so grateful. So thank you for stopping by. But I wanted to make this additional video on the topic, probably my last thought on this topic, as it probably should be at this point, because as I was taking in these comments, as I'm engaging with you guys on that video, I came across a couple other things that I wanted to add to the discussion for what they're worth, one of which was this fascinating quote by Elijah Wald, the author of Dylan Goes Electric, the book upon which A Complete Unknown is based, in which he talks about whatever, all this buzz about the historical accuracy of the film, the extent to which it departs from the facts. And let's hear from the horse's mouth himself, right? Elijah Wald. So this question is put to him. What did you think of the screening when he attended the screening? The guy who wrote the book, right? And he's going to watch this screening of this movie that treks miles away from the facts as they're known in his book. And I've already hashed all that out. I'm not going to go there again. Watch my last couple of videos for if you care to hear, more thoughts on fact versus fiction in A Complete Unknown. And his answer is the following. I think it's a really good movie. My pull quote is, it's not historically accurate, but it's poetically accurate, which I think is a wonderful way of tackling the question from the perspective of the guy who wrote the book, especially in the context of a guy in Dylan whose life has been steeped in poetry, right? And I really do believe that. That's not just me being a smartass, he continued. I'd expect there would be things that would bother me because Mangold was diverging from the real story, but what happened was he diverged so completely that I got caught up in the story. So, no surprise that Elijah Wald is conceding to the fact that Mangold departs from the historical objective facts of dealing with the 1955 Newport Folk Festival incident in Dylan's career and its impact and what happened before and after that. But I also, after taking in that quote, came across this really snarky piece in The Hollywood Reporter by a guy who apparently doesn't like people like me very much. And man, he really goes for the throat in this piece. I will, of course, link to this story in the comments on this video. An excerpt of the piece reads as follows. He says, the dominant mansplaining gene in Boomer and Gen X Dylan fans, the people who can listen to his creative cul-de-sac self-portrait Saved or his 3-disc collection of American Standards triplicate and say, yes, this is good, and let me tell you why, has been triggered by this picture. I know, because I'm doing my best to conquer it within myself. The biggest controversy, because it's the most glaring, comes during the climax of the film, when Dylan and his accompanists plug in their instruments and play a shocking short set of electric rock and roll at the saintly Newport Folk Festival. Amidst the boos in the crowd, we get a close-up of someone shouting, Judas! And, well, this has proven a bit too much for some know-it-alls. I guess I've been condemned to the know-it-all category. I want to say for the record, I most definitely am not a know-it-all. There are many people on Earth who know far more about Dylan, his music, and his career than I do, just as there are many people on Earth who know far more about filmmaking than I do, and I am perfectly fine with that. Okay. He goes on to say, yes, it's absolutely true that the famous Judas moment did not happen at Newport 65. It happened in Manchester, England, 10 months later. I talk about this on both of these videos that I've posted previous to this one about this topic. While it's perfectly fine to acknowledge these changes, it's another to dismiss the whole movie because of it. And if you're on Facebook pointing this out to people, as the man once said, please crawl out your window, an allusion to a Dylan track. All right. When I read that quote, I'm left thinking, what happened to the gray area? To criticize portions of this film is not to dismiss it in its entirety. How does one even come to such a conclusion about film or literary criticism? It's nuts. Is nuance dead? No one on this channel has dismissed the film in its entirety. No one ever will. The film is loaded with brilliant acting. As I said in both of my previous videos on this topic, go see it. I've said this in those clips, and I'll say it again here. Go see this movie. Go see it. I want you to. There is so much brilliant acting to enjoy in the film. Departure from the facts be damned. Again, I've said that before. I'll say it again. I'm saying it now. Go see it. I am not dismissing this film in its entirety. Far from it. You can find short after short on my YouTube channel in which I am praising actor after actor. Monica Barbaro. I've praised Ed Norton. I've praised Elle Fanning and Boyd Holbrook as Johnny Cash. You can go back and look at all of that. There's plenty to enjoy in this film. We're just, the fact that one criticizes portions of the film in no way entails a dismissal of the film in its entirety. I'm really struggling with that line of thought. I will forever believe that two things can be true at once. You can like portions of the film while also criticizing portions of the film. Both things can be true at once. It doesn't mean you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, okay? But a bigger point than that, it seems to me, might be the fact that we possibly are overlooking the elephant in the room of this conversation. We're not just talking about a guy in Bob Dylan who works in show business. We're not just talking about an entertainer. We're talking about a guy who won the freaking Nobel Prize in Literature. No American poet won the Nobel Prize in Literature before Bob did in 2016. It hadn't happened. And you think about the American poets that preceded Dylan, and I know the effete among the literary elite, the giants of American letters, by and large can't stand it when Dylan is described as a poet. And I'll get into that in a minute here. But you think of the poets that preceded him, right? Like Robert Frost won 4 Pulitzer Prizes. He wrote the poem that's famously quoted. I took the road less traveled by, and that made all the difference. 2 roads diverge in a wood, right? I mean, that Robert Frost, the guy who was the poet that came to speak at JFK's inauguration in 1960, right? Edwin Arlington Robinson, who won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. He wrote the poem Richard Cory that inspired the Simon and Garfunkel song by the same name. He didn't win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Dylan did. Robert Frost didn't win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Bob Dylan did. And you think of other huge names in American poetry who in some cases were often spoken of in the context of the Nobel Prize in Literature. I mean, John Ashbery, in 1976, his book Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, in the same year, wins the Pulitzer Prize, wins the National Book Award, wins the National Book Critics Circle Award. I believe he went on to win 1 more Pulitzer. Did he win 2 over the course of his career? Correct me if I'm wrong there. I know that he was nominated for a Nobel. I mean, his buddy David Lehman was a big proponent of nominating John Ashbery for the Nobel Prize. I mean, Theodore Rothke, Elizabeth Bishop, Anne Sexton, John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Adrienne Rich. These are monsters of American letters, none of whom won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Bob Dylan did. I mean, Adrienne Rich, diving into the wreck in 1973, opens with this explosive, literally and figuratively, opening line. Out in this desert, we are testing bombs. She divorces her husband, with whom she had 3 sons. In 1970, he kills himself. Months later, she From there, it ignites this whole, feminist women's liberation movement. She becomes a biting political force in literature and beyond. That book in 1973 was a bomb again in literature and in American culture, earth shaking and earthquake in many respects. Adrienne Rich was another, again, one of those monsters of American letters. It would have made perfect sense to me for her to win a Nobel Prize in literature. None of them did. Bob Dylan was the closest. I mean, T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, right? The closest we had come. He won the Nobel in 1948. But there's a little fly in the ointment there with T.S. Eliot, because born in St. Louis, lives there until I think he was 25 years old, moves to England in 1914, and later at, I believe, age 39, renounces his American citizenship. And so there you go. He wins the Nobel Prize, but America couldn't claim him because he renounced his citizenship. So it hadn't been done before Dylan did it. And I think this is a really substantial fact about Dylan's accomplishment overall. Beyond him taking the stage with a Stratocaster or an acoustic guitar in his hand, by winning the Nobel in 2016, himself became one of the giants of American letters. I mean, the first real American poet, for lack of a better phrase, to win the Nobel Prize was Louise Glück in 2020, 4 years after Dylan did it. And she ends up, ultimately, a few years later, she dies at age 80 in 2023. But she had previously herself won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Her books, The Wild Iris in 1992, Vita Nova in 1999, The Seven Ages in 2001, were brilliant. I obsessed over that stuff when I was a kid. And so again, when she was announced, I would have been, in fact, I was kind of, to be honest, and I know I'm speaking for many when I say this, the fact that Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature before Louise Glück is, to me, utterly bewildering. I understand it. I can certainly see why Bob Dylan would at least be spoken of in a Nobel Prize in Literature context. I mean, Christopher Ricks, an immensely active, well-regarded literary critic, was a Dylan freak and was screaming from rooftops that he deserved to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. But he was an exception to the rule. It pisses off the literary elite when Dylan is described as a poet. Dylan is not welcome in the gilded halls strolled by the literary establishment. He is not, and likely never will be. I think back on an interview that my favorite poet, Irish poet named Seamus Heaney, did with Charlie Rose, I think after he won the Nobel himself in literature in 1995. And he just sort of offhandedly, at one point in the conversation, I've not forgotten it since, mentions how he sort of grumbles that he wishes the term poet had not been so loosely applied as it is. And the veiled, implicit, observation there, I think, is, guys like Dylan, we shouldn't really just offhandedly call them poets. We real poets know. Yeah. A case in point, when Margaret Atwood, who always was spoken of, 85 years old, still around today, every year, to this day, it happens when the Nobel Prize in Literature is announced. All the buzz is, will Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale, finally win her Nobel? Well, she hasn't, and it seems like she never will, as was the case with Philip Roth, the novelist whose name also was always tossed around before his death at age 85 in 2018 within the Nobel Prize in Literature conversation. He died never having won it. When Margaret Atwood was told in 2016, when she first learned that Bob Dylan, instead of her, had won the Nobel Prize in Literature, her reaction was, and I quote, "For what? For what?" She was exasperated by the fact that Dylan had won the Nobel. And again, I think it's important that this is getting lost in this conversation about a complete unknown. This is about a man whose accomplishment extends well beyond the realm of entertainment, in large part because he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. I mean, John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize in Literature. W.B. Yeats won the Nobel Prize in Literature. The aforementioned T.S. Eliot, Toni Morrison. There's no one can take it away from Bob. He is a member of that club. So we're talking about a giant of American letters, not just a famous songwriter, not just a guy who, you know, is, as he hilariously put it in one of his snarky interviews in the mid 1960s, a song and dance man. We're talking about much more than that here. And case in point, the Oxford Book of American Poetry includes a Dylan song in its pages, again alongside any of the aforementioned great American poets I've named. Frederick Seidel, one of my favorites. I'd give him the Nobel Prize in Literature today. He's in there. Adrienne Rich is in there. You know, and he shares pages with these greats: Robert Frost, Edwin Arlington Robinson. They're all in there. Robert Creeley. I mean, whoever you want to name. Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, David Lehman, the editor of that Oxford Book of American Poetry, came out in 2006, decided to include a Dylan song, Desolation Row, in the pages of the Oxford Book of American Poetry. And the head note on Dylan's entry in the book reads as follows: the songwriter and singer was born Robert Zimmerman in Duluth, Minnesota, and spent much of his boyhood in Hibbing near the Canadian border. He named himself after Dylan Thomas. The lyrics in 3 of his record albums from the mid-1960s, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde, particularly reward close analysis of the sort given to demanding examples of modern poetry. Read on the page, independent of musical accompaniment or vocal delivery, Desolation Row may be his finest lyric. This is the closing track on Highway 61 Revisited. The critic Christopher Ricks, who I just mentioned, who had previously written books about Milton, Keats, Tennyson, T.S. Eliot, Samuel Beckett, devoted a lengthy volume also to Dylan's Visions of Sin in 2004. Ricks analyzes a stanza in Desolation Row, the one in which Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot are, quote, fighting in the captain's tower, in relation to Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Archibald Macleish once complimented Dylan on the same lines. Pound and Eliot were too scholastic, weren't they? Macleish said, I knew them both, hard men. We have to go through them. But I know what you mean when you say they are fighting in a captain's tower. Recalling Macleish's words, Dylan made no comment other than to allow that he liked Eliot, who was, quote, worth reading, but disapproved of Pound's anti-American propaganda from Italy in World War II and never did read him. By the way, don't mess with these poets. Archibald Macleish was reading once with Robert Frost in attendance. When Robert Frost lit a fire, he lit some programs on fire in his lap to take attention away from Archibald Macleish. Is such the psychotic self-promoter Robert Frost was. Look it up. Go ahead, have some fun with that one. I can link to a story about that in the comments on YouTube as well. So this is a quarrelsome bunch. You never know. Pyromaniacs among them, apparently. So generally, the literary establishment was livid and bewildered about Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize in 2016. There were some kind remarks. Salman Rushdie said, from Orpheus to Fayez, song and poetry have been closely linked. Dylan is the brilliant inheritor of the bardic tradition. Great choice. That said, Dylan himself, in his publicly available Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which I'll link to in the description, tells the Swedish Academy that he does not think that songs are literature in typical Dylan fashion, right? Isaac Fitzgerald said, I'm not mad at it. I stretching boundaries is good, and lyrics having literary merit is good, but there were lots of mean tweets. Lots of them after this announcement was made. So this is a man who has created earthquakes within the literary community apart from music. Okay, listen to these mean tweets. One author said, oh, I totally get the Nobel Committee. Reading books is hard. Another one said, apparently embarrassing dad who responds to your hip-hop records by telling you Dylan was the real poet runs the Nobel Committee. Rob Delaney, an author with 1.4 million followers on Twitter, tweeted, Bob Dylan wins the Nobel Prize in Literature? What's next? Derek Jeter wins a Tony for his rice pilaf? Another one said, if they don't give the Nobel to Kendrick Lamar in 2030, there will be trouble. Yet another said, when Bob Dylan wins a Nobel, and you think of the dude in your life and his deep affinity for Dylan, and what I call peak white man music. Peak white man music. Two of the musicians backing Bob Dylan at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival were black. Bassist Jerome Arnold, drummer Sam Lay, both from the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. If it were not for Bob's worship of black musicians, there would be no Bob Dylan. So I don't know. I struggle with that remark. Is Jimi Hendrix's cover of All Along the Watchtower, is that peak white man music? What about Isaac Hayes' cover of Lay Lady Lay? Is that peak white man music? That's the box we can comfortably put Bob's music in? Anyway, moving on. Another mean tweet about Bob winning this prize was someone who said the Swedish Academy will not stop trolling Philip Roth. Poor Philip. I'm perfectly comfortable, and for what it's worth, I'm just a guy on YouTube, who's listened to a lot of Dylan over the decades. For what it's worth, I have no problem describing Bob as a poet in addition to a songwriter. I mean, one of my favorite stanzas is from a great song he wrote called Dark Eyes for his 1985 album Empire Burlesque. Yes, Bob was still writing powerfully in the 1980s, contrary to public perceptions, and I am eager to post a video on that topic. I'm thinking about posting 10 masterpieces from Bob Dylan's 1980s period, and there are more than that. This is one of them. And listen to these gorgeous lyrics that to me do arise to whatever standard it is by which someone can officially be declared a poet as opposed to merely a songwriter. This stanza in Dark Eyes reads, "Oh, the French girl, she's in paradise, and a drunken man is at the wheel. Hunger pays a heavy price to the falling gods of speed and steel. Oh, time is short and the days are sweet, and passion rules the arrow that flies. A million faces at my feet, but all I see are dark eyes." And here's that stanza from Desolation Row, that the head note in that David Lehman edited anthology of the Oxford Book of American Poetry, the one in which T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound are named. It reads as follows: "Praise be to Nero's Neptune, the Titanic sails at dawn. Everybody's shouting, 'Which side are you on?' And Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot fighting in the captain's tower, while calypso singers laugh at them and fishermen hold flowers between the windows of the sea where lovely mermaids flow, and nobody has to think too much about Desolation Row." I think of other great lyrics that to me I can read on the page as well as listen to and find at least as much to compliment. I mean, tracks like Idiot Wind from Blood on the Tracks, Changing of the Guards from Street Legal, Where Are You Tonight from the same record, Joker Man from the Infidels sessions, Foot of Pride, left off the official Infidels record that came out in '83, but later came out in Bootleg Series Volumes 1 to 3. Lou Reed he enjoyed covering Foot of Pride live for a reason. It's a powerfully, brilliantly written song. The aforementioned Dark Eyes. I mean, this guy wrote great stuff for a great period of time. And so my question is this: the reason I bring up the fact that we're talking about a Nobel laureate, not just a songwriter, the reason I feel concerned that that's getting lost in this conversation about a complete unknown is I just wonder, would we play so fast and loose with the facts and the lives of any of the most famous writers to win the Nobel Prize in Literature? I mean, again, we're talking about, William Faulkner, T.S. Eliot, Rudyard Kipling, W.B. Yeats, John Steinbeck, Toni Morrison, Ernest Hemingway. Our country should be proud, it seems to me, and elated to know that it gave rise to these literary geniuses. And its curiosity as to how that happened is entirely justified, normal, and frankly, urgent, I would say. I think this may be why some of Dylan's more ardent fans struggle with the twisting of the facts of his life for any purpose. It's a biopic, it's a documentary, it's a book, whatever. Bob Dylan belongs among these literary giants who join him among the mere 121 people in the history of humanity to have won a Nobel Prize in Literature. Only 18 of which were women, by the way, which I consider to be a stain on the Swedish Academy. Shame on them. 18 of the 121 people to win the Nobel Prize in Literature have been women. Only 18. And that's why one reason why Dylan's 2016 award provoked such outrage, because that year not a single woman won a Nobel Prize in any category. It was all men. That did not help Dylan's selection in the literature category that year. Okay, someday, all of this caginess aside, all of the fun we have, the tongue in cheek, Dylan, creates this mystique about him. As Springsteen said, he sustained his mystery for half a century, and we're rollicking along with, throwing a fact out here, inserting speculation there, or a made up story here as we're assembling the life of this guy. Someday we're gonna, it seems to me, because this is a Nobel laureate, a guy who won the Nobel Prize in literature, like John Steinbeck, like some of our, Toni Morrison, our greatest authors that American culture has ever given rise to. We're gonna need a scrupulous, comprehensive, authoritative, definitive, multi-volume biography on Dylan, just as we have with, like, a W.H. Auden. There's a great 2-volume biography of his. I hate to say it, the author of that is escaping me, but I loved it. That's what we're going to need with Bob at some point. The closest we've gotten to that on screen, to me, is Martin Scorsese's 2005 documentary No Direction Home. Will forever be shocked at how somehow Scorsese, whom I guess Dylan trusted, they worked on The Last Waltz, the band, documentary, the famed farewell show to the band. Scorsese he's done a subsequent documentary about the Rolling Thunder Revue that Dylan toured with in the mid '70s. He did a documentary about the Rolling Stones, right? So I guess there was just a built-in, baked-in, long-standing, decades-long trust there that enabled Scorsese to somehow get Dylan to speak rather straightforwardly about his childhood in Hibbing. He's talking about how his dad would, like, make him sweep the floor in his shop and stuff like this, and maybe to teach him work ethic or whatever. Dylan expresses just as straightforwardly his dismay with the media and why they pissed him off, why he became so distrustful and weary and leery of them, and played with them to the extent that he has for decades. There's plenty of evidence of that on YouTube, the fun he's had with reporters over the years. I don't know how Martin did it, man, but that was a stroke of magic. You got to see it if you care about the life and work of Dylan. If you really want to get Dylan to speak more plainly in a less cagey fashion about his life, that's the place to go if you want that on film. To be sure, there's been some admirable attempts at this kind of biography. I mean, Ian Bell's 2-volume biography, The Lives of Bob Dylan, that's a good place to start. One is Time Out of Mind. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the title of the other volume, the earlier one, I believe. But ultimately, I don't think such a biography is going to be possible until Dylan's days are done. And believe me, I hope they're never done. I hope Bob becomes the only human in the history of humanity to live until the end of time. And you know what? With a song catalog like his, with an earth-shaking impact such as his, with the world still stormily debating his significance and how to process it, he very well might live till the end of time, in his own way, just as he's done everything else in his life.